Westminster Confession, chapter 5, paragraph 4, addressing one of the most profound questions addressed in the Westminster Confession, and it's talking about God's providence and his governance over everything that happens in nature, and especially that even over all of his creatures, both men and angels, he has directed all of their actions and even their thoughts according to his own purposes. And so it raises the question, well, if everything happens according to God's immutable will, are the evil things that are done in this creation, are those according to his will? Well, Westminster chapter 5, paragraph 4 addresses this question for us, and this is what it says. The almighty power, unsearchable wisdom, and infinite goodness of God so far manifest themselves in his providence that it extendeth itself even to the first fall and all other sins of angels and men. So this is saying that not only the evil things that happen in this world have been ordered, foreordained by God's eternal decree, and have been ordered by him and governed by him in his providence, but even the fall itself was purposed by God. And you might hear that and say, okay, well, God's a king, and maybe we could say he allowed evil things to happen. Maybe he didn't will them to happen, but he has allowed them to happen because he wants to give people free will. And Westminster doesn't let us say that, because it goes on and it says, and that not by a bare permission, but such as hath joined with a most wise and powerful bounding, and otherwise ordering and governing of them in a manifold dispensation to his own holy ends. So this says the fall and all the evil things that happen in this world were not simply by God's bare permission. He let them happen. It's stronger than that. He has ordered them according to his purposes. And the way that I think about that is, it's not so much that God made evil things, because God is only good. But I think of evil kind of like a hammer. It's like a tool that he's taken. And he's taken in his hand and he's directed it according, he's building something, he's creating something, he has made use of it. And that God is so abundantly good that he can actually take evil and order it and use it for his own glory and for his own purposes, and ultimately for good. This is profound. Now, we might be tempted to leave it there and say, wow, even the evil things, all the evil things that have happened to us, they were just simply God's will and he wanted them to happen. Again, Westminster does not leave it there either. It goes on. Yet so, as the sinfulness thereof proceedeth only from the creature and not from God, who, being most holy and righteous, neither is nor can be the author or approver of sin. Evil does not come from God. He is only good. You say, Matt, wow, this is a profound mystery. Was evil God's will or not? Well, in some ways, yes, according to his eternal decree and according to his providence, yes, he did will it. And yet, God is only good. And so in another way, he is not the approver of sin. And so, an example of this from the Bible is the famous story of Joseph. Joseph in Genesis was kidnapped by his brothers and he was sold into slavery, and he lived in a dungeon for over a decade. And then eventually he was raised up in Egypt to become the prime minister of Egypt, and he rescues nations and rescues his whole family from a famine. And at the end of the story, he says to his brothers, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And when we look at the story of Joseph and we say, wow, God really had a purpose for Joseph. Was it God's will that Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, kidnapped him and sold him into slavery? Well, on the one hand, you read the book of Genesis and you say, well, clearly it was God's purpose. That was what his plan was. He was going to rescue his family. And yet when you come to Exodus chapter 21, we find in the law of God that kidnapping is a capital crime. God's law reveals to us his will. God hates kidnapping. God is opposed to kidnapping. God judges kidnapping. And so in that sense, no, kidnapping is not God's will. And both of these things are true. And I think actually in our own lives, we need both of these things. You imagine you meet a fellow Christian who shares with you that they've experienced maybe trauma or abuse in their life, maybe just terrible things that have happened to them. And they're wondering, was this God's will that this happened to me? Well, I think our first answer should be, no, God's law says that these things are evil. God is not the approver of sin. He is the judge, and the things that happen in the darkness, he will expose, and he will vindicate the innocent. He stands against evil. He is grieved against evil. He is angry against evil. That's the first statement. No, this is not God's will according to his revealed will in his law. And yet, as we come to know the Lord, we come to a place where we begin to see that he has written our whole story. And he's taken evil events and he's woven them into a beautiful story that is ultimately for his glory. And we come to a place where we say, even the evil things that have happened to us, I believe that God purposed them. And I actually praise and trust him in all of them that they may be used for his glory. And the way I like to think of it is if you have a certain event that maybe has happened in your life and you say, did God will that this evil event happened? Is to name that event by itself as evil. And yet the story that God is writing that included that event is good. And God's purposes are good. This paradox, this tension, I think is beautifully described for us here in the Westminster Confession. And so in answering the question, is evil God's will? There's two answers. According to his law and his revealed will, no, he is not the approver of sin. But according to his eternal purposes, yes, he has willed all things to ultimately be for his glory. And so we will trust him. And now here is a question for your discussion. As we think about the evil that has happened in our lives and the lives of others, why is it important that we affirm both that evil is not God's will, according to his law, and it is God's will according to his providence and eternal decree?